Welcome to the first breakout panel in this in ORF's G20 presentation. And I'm Mihir Sharma, and I am a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. And I'm very pleased to be here discussing essentially the many ways in which we believe the multilateral system may be under strain at this time, and what are the ways perhaps in which we can see it moving forward, or even are there mechanisms that we can imagine or conceive of that could help repair it. And I'm very happy to have a particularly distinguished panel with me today, a group of people who've been thinking about these issues for decades. And the way that we're going to do this is that I'll go around the panel and ask them to deliver 5 to 7 minutes of sort of opening remarks on the questions as they see them that we should address, and then the conversation will become more general. And I'll introduce each panelist as I ask them to make their opening statement. So if I might start with you, Claudia. Claudia Schmucker has been head of the DGAP's Globalization and World Economy Program since 2002. And she's published extensively on European and transatlantic trade policy, on the WTO, the history of the WTO and its challenges in historical context. And she has a PhD in economics as well. So Claudia, over to you. Start us off, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also for being part of this very interesting panel. I will focus in my statement on global trade policy and the reform of the WTO and ask what the G20 can do in this context. So what I did, I first had a look at the impact of the pandemic on the global trade order, because a global pandemic like the one we witness right now is a prime example of why we need more global cooperation and improved global governance structures, as individual nation states can no longer successfully combat these crises alone. But what we do see is exactly the opposite. So first, many G20 countries reverted to nationalist and protectionist trade policies instead of engaging in more multilateral cooperation. And the second problem is that the pandemic acted as an accelerator of existing geoeconomic tensions, namely the increasing geoeconomic rivalry between the United States and China, two G20 members. And if the two major players rely on their own economic strength to pursue their national interests, then multilateral organizations which establish global rules are losing their relevance. As a consequence, the WTO is experiencing its deepest crisis since its creation, and informal forums such as the G20 or also the G7 have lost their effectiveness. So this brings me to the next two questions that I want to take together. The first one was, how can the G20 help ameliorate the deteriorating multilateral economic order? And the second, how can policymakers spur cross-border trade and investment? And I believe that the two questions belong together. For the G20, from my point of view, the most important trade issue in the next years to come is the reform of the World Trade Organization. And if the G20 succeed, this will also strengthen cross-border trade and investment. And in my view, it will strengthen the G20 and the effectiveness of the group as well. So what we see right now, also during the pandemic, is that the WTO, as a guardian of a transparent and rules-based trading system, is in a profound crisis. And actually, G20 member states are part of the reason for this. So when we look at all the four pillars, they're all in crisis. We look at the dispute settlement pillar, namely the appellate body, which has been paralyzed since December 2019. We look at the negotiating pillar, the Doha development agenda, that has been deadlocked for quite some time, also because of mistrust between major G20 members. We look at the rulemaking pillar of the WTO, which is not sufficient, particularly regarding the use of subsidies. And finally, the monitoring function of the WTO is hampered by the lack of notification by major G20 players. Many stakeholders, including the EU, have presented reform proposals on that. However, so far there has been no real progress. So the question is, what's the role of the G20 in this regard? The G20 calls itself the premier forum for international economic cooperation. It represents a critical mass of world trade, and it must play a collective leadership role in WTO reform. However, as we all know, this will not be easy because the dividing lines in trade between the major stakeholders, such as China, EU, US, and India, run right through the G20 membership. But in my view, this must not prevent the G20 from tackling this issue, because if there is political will, the possibility of WTO reform exists. So what are the necessary next steps for the G20? My first point: success builds upon success, and that means that G20 member states have to restore trust that concrete outcomes can be achieved in the context of the WTO. Therefore, the G20 need to establish a dialogue platform to help identify new initiatives and resolve controversial issues. And this could already start now, when G20 member states should discuss the role of the organization in the pandemic. And here I believe the G20 member states need to answer two questions. First, how can G20 member states ensure that the WTO or how can the WTO ensure that global value chains are not disrupted? And this regards particularly food and pharmaceutical supply chains. And the second question that G20 countries need to address is, how can the WTO facilitate access to affordable pharmaceutical and medical goods? There's a really good EU initiative on trade and health products. And I really hope that a lot of G20 member states will join to make this initiative happen. And I believe that showing progress on these issues during the pandemic in the context of the G20 will help the future reform of the WTO. A second step where I believe that G20 member states should engage on is on the modernization of WTO rules and on new trade topics. The Doha round is deadlocked, and I believe that G20 member states should therefore consider plurilateral agreements to facilitate the modernization of trade rules. These agreements have to be inclusive, and they have to be incorporated at the WTO level. Right now, in my view, the most important initiative is the one on e-commerce. We have more than 90 countries who are engaging in this initiative, and I think that all G20 member states should engage in making this initiative successful. My final point on the G20 and the WTO, I think on all these issues of WTO reform, and this also includes the dispute settlement that I haven't mentioned so far, the G20 countries should give a clear mandate to the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group, which is composed of representatives from the respective trade ministers. And in this framework, I believe G20 countries should find compromises and establish a concrete work program for the WTO. The real compromise, as we all know, needs to be found at the organization, but I think that G20 in the upcoming presidencies can play a decisive role in overcoming deadlocks and restoring the global trade order. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent explanation of where the G20 is where the WTO is currently deadlocked, and a sense of what the G20 could possibly do in order to try and get things moving at the WTO in a way that they have not been for some years now. I'll turn now to Rohinton Medora, who's president of CIGI in Waterloo in Canada, and who's in particular a student of the multilateral system and written extensively on international economic relations, and with particular reference to maybe Canadian relations with developing countries. And Rohinton, if I may, could you give us 5 to 7 minutes on the subject?
Mihir, thank you. I want to thank you and the ORF for bringing us together for this timely discussion. Also to thank you for having found the nicest way to call me old when in your opening statement you said this is a panel that has spent decades thinking about these issues. And then I thought,
in
wow.
aggregate.
In aggregate, there, you saved yourself. Well, whatever. I guess I'd begin by saying a number of things. One, that the G20 has been in drift for some time. And that drift was even before COVID came along. There was a sense that there was a disinterest in cooperation in many of the key countries that drove cooperation and globalization in the last few decades. Second, there was the contested ascendancy of China. And third, and related to that, there was a sense that the new digital technologies came with a winner-take-all underlying economics. And as a result, there was just a lot more sharp elbows in the way global cooperation happened. The G20 actually was created precisely because we needed countries that do not see eye to eye to come together. And so having only a virtual set of summits did not help. And so in that sense, COVID sort of went to the heart of the process of the G20 by preventing leaders who otherwise might not agree and have fundamentally different worldviews to actually talk to each other in the corridors, offline, online, and in the words of one prime minister, sort of look each other in the eye and hash things out. Now, COVID therefore accelerated underlying trends, but I don't believe it created them. COVID-19 has absolutely been cataclysmic for the world as a whole. As Claudia pointed out, in the early months especially, there was a sense of trade nationalism which was self-defeating. I think we've pulled away from the worst of it, but of course not all of it. Supply chain resilience, supply chain reshaping, because of the question of China's ascendancy, is all now on the table. The G20 has not, other than saying a few good things about it, done much about that. And I do think whether it's the WTO or whether it's plurilateral agreements that shape the WTO, and I'll come to that in a second, there is a role to play for the G20 to assert that cooperation in trade and investment is superior to autarky. I'm less optimistic than some are on e-commerce, just because we now know through the RCEP agreement what China's bottom line on data governance would be. And it is fundamentally a question of saying data are not just about commerce and e-commerce. Data come with a set of other social, political, and economic considerations which go to the core of how countries assert themselves and organize themselves. China is extremely big on data localization and a set of issues which I think go against the grain of simply seeing data as enabling e-commerce. And I think the e-commerce negotiations will be a real harbinger of what is to follow. On finance, we have seen uneven macroeconomic responses across the world. Uneven in the sense that traditional macroeconomic budget constraints have been thrown aside in countries that could afford to throw them aside. So in my country, Canada, and the US, in the European Union, we're kind of in a spend and spend and spend mode. Many countries in the developing world do not have the same freedom to spend because they're under strictures from various multilateral organizations and donors. And so that uneven fiscal space is going to come back to haunt us, particularly because the G20's debt relief plan is as timid as it is. And that's something to look out for, is the day of reckoning for taxpayers in countries that have gone on a spending spree, and the lack of macroeconomic room and fiscal space in countries that cannot do so. And I think there are social and political consequences in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and parts of South Asia to be reckoned. I would sort of also mention that COVID-19, and I'll end on this point, has underlined several issues in digital governance. The fact that we're able to have this conference virtually, the fact that most of us can work from home, but the large majority of humanity cannot and cannot afford to stay home, has underlined the importance of cybersecurity, the digital divide, and the fact that we need a much more resilient backbone when it comes to digital functioning, which then spills over into things like cyber currencies and fintech, and indeed supply chain resilience. The widespread use of tracking apps has highlighted the importance of the nexus and trade-off that comes around issues to do with privacy, the public good, public health, and indeed human rights. There are slippery slopes here when it comes to the surveillance society that we've gotten into because of COVID-19. And we simply don't have the wherewithal to understand or have a common understanding of what the limits to the use of surveillance are. This is new area for the G20. It's been making noises about this for some time. Digital taxation, another example where the G20 has been stumbling along, but the time has come to perhaps be more forthright. And with in-person summits in Italy and beyond, perhaps we will be able to do so. And the final point, and I'll stop on this one, is one that Claudia asserted already, but worth thinking about, that COVAX is one small bright spot that emerges from all of this. Key countries have not signed on. Many countries have overpurchased vaccines. But if COVAX leads to a sense of cooperation and, more importantly, revisiting certain global IP rules and revisiting how science and data are managed, then I think we're onto something. So the G20 has a full and newish, but not that new agenda in front of it. And I think Italy, Indonesia, and India have their work cut out for them. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Valentin. And I think that you're quite right in laying out the sort of challenges that we're facing at this moment. I'll turn now to Klaus Milke, who's joining us, I think, probably from Hamburg. Klaus Milke is the chairman of the steering group of the International Platform Foundation 20. Is the chairman of the board of the Foundation for Sustainability, has been thinking about issues in particular, particularly related to sustainable development for some time. And Klaus, I would, if I might ask you now for your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me and all what you have done with ORF on these issues. And I count on ORF also for the next month and next years. Also regarding the G20 presidency of India in 2020 on implementation of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. That was the outcome of the year 2015. And at the end of 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement. Two goals in between of the SDGs are reflecting on these issues, climate and energy, goal 7, energy for all, and goals 13 on climate protection. And we are very clear that the G20 have to do the utmost to implement, because all other countries in the world are dependent on the G20, on this big group of those who bring up 80% of the CO2 emissions worldwide. And so they have a tremendous obligation, but they have also the political, the economic, and the technical conditions to do it in the right way. But they have to speed up, because we have only a very small window of opportunity to combat the climate crisis and to combat the crisis on biodiversity. These two crises are interconnected, and good luck to G20. It was on the table for many times, for many years, not in a very ambitious way, but there was a good narrative to do what is necessary. And of course, we all had the big problem with Mr. Trump in the last 4 years. But now there's a new opportunity for more multilateralism. And that was also the result of the G20 summit of Saudi Arabia. So more multilateralism, yes, but weak in terms of actions, what is really needed on sustainability. And what Claudia said, I think there is an interconnection. Sustainability without trade is impossible, but to do it in the right way, connected, as Valentin said, with human rights. And the SDGs, that is absolutely necessary for the future of the generations in the world, but also with those people just now living on Earth. So what can be done in this direction? We heard some good announcements from the Italian presidency just now. And we think there could be some outcome of the next year, the 2021 year with the Italian presidency. And we have all to see the Italian presidency is in that time where we have the European Green Deal to bring it into action. So the Italians, the Europeans have to do their very best to make it real and to make it in a positive way and inviting way for others in the world. So we have a European Green Deal somehow, or I hope we will have one. And it should be not only green, but also inclusive, and invite others to do their job, like you, me here in India, to bring up an Indian green and inclusive deal. And at the end, together with our Canadian friends, to have a global green and inclusive deal. That is absolutely necessary. And in these COVID-19 times, of course, we have to reflect on more resilience and recovering better. There's an amount of money on the table, but how it is used in the right way. There are some positive examples also in Germany, also coming from the EU, but others are poor, some on other sides in the world. So how to interact on this? And that is perhaps a possibility of foundations in a good link to each other worldwide to show up what are the learning curves in different parts of the world, and to tell it to the Sherpas of the G20, what is possible, what is needed, and who is there to act in a positive way together with them. I think there's an opportunity, there's a tremendous chance in front of us, and perhaps foundations can be somehow a bridge between business, the finance sector, think tanks, civil society, and politics. So we are informal engagement groups. We are not an official one, but to be an official engagement group that brings up the opportunity to bridge between the others in a right way. And we count on continuity. We do our work now since 4 years. And we did a good job, I think, even with our Saudi foundation, the King Khalid Foundation this year. And we have wonderful partners now in Italy. I hope in 2022, in Indonesia, and in 23 in India. We have good partners there already. And what is important for me as a German, Germany has a G20 presidency in 2022. And to understand G7 is somehow part of G20, and how to interact from the G7 level towards the G20 level, I think that is also quite important. Next year it's UK with G7, and UK has a climate summit at the end of next year. So how to interlink this in the right way? Here I stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And finally, for opening remarks, I'll turn to Stacey Wharton, who's the Executive Director of Global Market Development at the Milken Institute. She has considerable experience in various different sectors, in think tank world, in academia, and in the private sector as well. And is particularly expert on the question of using capital markets to promote development in the emerging world. Stacey, please, if you could take over and give us your 5 to 7 minutes of thoughts on the subject.
Well, this is the last time I go last on one of these panels because so many of the most important points have already been made. I'll keep my remarks short so that we have enough time for questions. But I don't know if I'm hopeful. I will suggest a few things at the end, but look, we are potentially going to lose, according to the IMF, 4.4% of global GDP, 4.4% drop. That is a very big drop in global GDP. 150 million people, according to the World Bank, could be pushed back into dire poverty. 150 million people. That's about it's almost half the population of the United States. That would erase 2 decades of growth and economic opportunity and moving up a ladder of development in a year or two. The IMF has suggested that an uncoordinated response to this pandemic would cost 2/3 more than a coordinated response. Not 10% more, not 20% more, not 30% more, 65% more than an uncoordinated response. But can we do that? I mean, the UK and the European Union can't even preserve, it seems to me, a trade agreement that's going to expire at the end of the year. They're fighting over fishing rights, which is a minuscule part of the UK economy. They can't even agree on whether they agree. You know, the United States can't even kind of pass a budget resolution to fund the government and to put money in people's hands. And the G20, and you know, the Milken Institute is, of course, a nonpartisan organization. I want to say that up front. But the Trump administration has been absolutely disastrous for any kind of coordinated global response on anything. I mean, I think he even said he was going to show up at this G20 meeting 24 hours in advance, and then he played golf during the last day of it. We just can't have that kind of turning back on these very important fora for international cooperation. During the global financial crisis, the G20 met 3 times in 1 year. That was, I think, the heyday, actually, of the G20 period, you know, starting with President Bush and carried forward by President Obama. That during that time of that terrible period, the G20 was actually viewed as a very important tool to solving the problem. And I come at this from a deep caring of what happens to developing countries in all of this. And, you know, not to assign fault at all, but they, you know, if you look at Africa, they did absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, you know, they are just a victim of this crisis. They are very dependent on the Chinese economy. They are a just-in-time household economy. If you are, you know, earning your food on Monday, eating on Tuesday, and going back and earning it on Wednesday, you cannot stay home. That is not an option that's available to you. And they have done what they are, you know, the best that they can on both the health aspects and the quarantine aspects. But, you know, as Rohinton said earlier, they don't have the fiscal space, and they don't have the monetary policy transition mechanisms either to implement the kinds of things that the rich countries have done. You know, the United States has spent $3 trillion. Japan has spent over now $2 trillion on its own domestic responses. Developing countries don't have, you know, this kind of luxury. And so it is imperative if during a global pandemic and a climate crisis like we have right now, we can't get our act together in the G20. I don't know. I really don't know what could possibly motivate us to get our act together in the G20. So I'll throw out a couple of high-level thoughts, and we'll be happy to elaborate on them if I'm ever called upon to do so. Number one, this is a new administration in the United States, so I think President President-elect Biden should immediately signal his support of the G20 and immediately call a G20 meeting. I think we should have an extraordinary G20 meeting to start off 2021, just to show the importance of this forum for the global coordination of this response. 2, I think we should call upon countries to decide whether they want to sit at the big boy table or not. And if they want to sit at the big boy table, that means they have to participate in the big boy table kinds of global responses. And that means debt relief for developing countries, and that means China, and that means India taking part in those negotiations, becoming part of the Paris Club and taking part in those kinds of global coordinated efforts towards developing countries, doing their part on the climate as well, which I know coming from the United States, I can't exactly throw stones on this, but hopefully that will also get better in the new administration. Number 3, I think we should look around to things that are working. A very good example of international coordinated response is, of course, the world central banks. The United States has lent and made available $60 billion of dollar funding to partner central banks to make sure that the pandemic crisis and the economic crisis is not exacerbated by a financial crisis on the back of that. And that's the kind of decision-making and very quick decision-making I think that we can learn from. Second is the African Nations Procurement Initiative. They put together a website where all African procurement initiatives go through this mechanism, this platform. It's more than a website, so let's call it a platform, where countries are given allocations of critical supplies. They are done, those allocations are derived based on things like population and GDP and need and et cetera. And the countries, and and people that want to supply, it's a very transparent bidding process so that countries can't be kind of picked off against each other. They also can trade. Look, I've got more of these, protective equipment than I need, but I need less, of these things. And can you can kind of trade on your allocations. But there are examples of that are working. And I think we need to look to those and to see why they work and in what ways are they working and how we can apply those kind of mechanisms more broadly. And last, I think the developing countries in particular, and I care about the fiscal space and the debt relief and the participation in developing countries. So that's what I'm speaking to, but they need a way to organize themselves to present kind of a more of a mutual front towards their creditors. The creditors are very well organized. They have the Paris Club, the private sector creditors have the IIF, they have multilateral organizations. And what they do is they kind of pick off these debtor countries one by one and threaten them with ratings downgrades and lack of access to financing. And the creditor nations in a situation like this need a secretariat or a forum to come together and to get some economies of scale to legal and banking expertise so that they can participate on a more equal footing. And I can talk more about that, but I think that would be a very interesting G20 initiative for India to spearhead. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stacey, for that sort of refreshingly realistic take on what the sort of problems that we are facing right now might be. And I'm going to sort of riff off some of that energy, if you don't mind. And maybe I'll turn to Rohinton now and say, Rohinton, here's my concern. The G20 was energized, became what it was now as the sort of maybe the premier location for international coordination in the face of crises in response to the 2008 financial crisis. And that was a crisis in which every country benefited from every other country expanding its stimulus a particular way, keeping trade finance in particular going, which was the G20's first great success. In some sense, there weren't any divisions and differences of opinion as to what to do and why we were there and how to get out of it. So within the G20, those differences of opinions weren't very stark, weren't very sharp. We're now in a very different crisis, and one in which I think it's fair to say that existing differences of opinion about how the world is organized and the global order have been sharpened by the actions that various countries have taken, each in their own national interest. And in this crisis, it appears that the individual national interest may not have added up together, may not have meshed together as well as it did in 2008 to create a multilateral response. What I'm trying to say here is, Rohinton, perhaps 2008 created the G20, one crisis created the G20. Is this crisis going to kill it? And if not, how do we ensure it doesn't?
I think your analysis here is fundamentally correct, meaning that the G20 was good at crisis management 12 years ago. And the drift that we have seen since is because once we were out of a crisis and we had to do the sort of patient, long-term, roll up your sleeves, structural governance work, it slowed down. And so there was great incentive to create the Financial Stability Forum and turn it into the Financial Stability Board. But the next step really is to turn this into a treaty-based organization and make it the fourth leg in the stool that holds global economies together. And we're very far from that. Second point, 12 years is a long time ago. And 12 years ago, there was a sense that globalization was still the solution if only we could do more of it. That has frayed even in the last 12 years. And I think the unevenness of globalization and the fact that entire regions and classes in the US and in Western Europe were hollowed out by the very globalization that was supposed to benefit all of the world, that is what sort of has led to the kind of populism that we have seen. And so this is exactly how you would expect a globalization that is hugely liberal when it comes to technology and finance, less liberal when it comes to trade, even less liberal when it comes to movement of peoples, and really sluggish when it comes to regulation and keeping up with the times. If you have that kind of multi-speed globalization, the uneven impacts between West and East, if I could sort of generalize, would lead to exactly the kinds of skepticism of cooperation that we now see, particularly in the drivers of prosperity in the post-war era. The final point I'd make on why, and then I'll end on a hopeful note though, on why I think then is different from now, is that then no one was against more trade or freer trade or stronger banks. But when it comes to free trade in data, when it comes to understanding how digital technologies work and the huge fixed costs and geoeconomics behind the way digital technologies play out, it's not clear that cooperative solutions are superior to autarky. And so what you see is this fracturing of data zones with the China zone, the US zone, and the GDPR zone, and other countries kind of looking in. You put all of that together and it's not a good time. And so then to your question, so is this the end of the G20? I think there are two things we should look out for. One, the G7 is expanding to become a bit of a D10. And so you will see a bloc that includes India, South Korea, Australia, and we will see the reemergence of liberal thinking on the one side and perhaps less liberal on the other. And that kind of negotiation may lead to impasse or it may lead to progress. But I think look out for the G7 to transform itself into the D10. Second, I don't think the G20 is going to wither away, if only because, unlike President Trump, it is simply not in President-elect Biden's genes to sort of go play golf during a session. So he will do all the right things to make this work. I still think that there is hope. I'd say the OECD processes on ethical statements on new technologies and on digital taxation have some legs. And I think those are the kinds of things we should look out for, along with a quite more generous debt relief. If we make progress on those three, then I think there's some hope yet for the G20. If not, though, Mihir, I think your statement might well be the one that plays out.
Thank you, Rohinton. Claudia, I'm going to move on from a particular thing that Rohinton said and maybe take it to you. One of the big unfinished agenda, trade agenda, things on the trade agenda that you mentioned, that Rohinton mentioned just now, is this question of e-commerce and the related question of open and free data movement. And I think that here we have, in some fundamental way, something that goes beyond what maybe the WTO was originally designed to think about. Because there was an understanding when the WTO was formed that there is a single, if you reduce tariffs, you know what happens. You know that there will be certain benefits and you know that there will be certain costs. But by and large, those are knowable benefits and knowable costs, and you can weigh them against each other. And in the aggregate, you can move towards lowering tariffs. When it comes to something like the movement of data and of and therefore of broader agreement on e-commerce, suddenly you're in a realm also of values, of questions of privacy, questions of state control, questions of corporate freedom in some cases, corporate taxation in other cases, and suddenly you are you're not only in a location where values are being contested, but you're in a location where people don't actually agree about what the outcomes of policies might be. So it's very hard to negotiate under those considerations. And again, if we're going to have hope that the G20 can be the sort of embryo for a broader WTO level agreement on e-commerce, how is it that you think we're going to start reconciling some of these differing values and differing expectations from the data trade?
Thank you very much. There are many questions involved in this, and I have to find a way to start saying that. And maybe I just have one comment to what Valentin said before. I think we need to accept that the G20 and the G7, they are informal groups. So even if one country is no longer interested in cooperation, that will ruin the whole group. And this is what we saw. And the US is not only one country, but one of the major countries. And if they lose interest in cooperation, there's really nothing the G20 can do. But I think it will stay alive because it was founded, and we saw reasons for doing that. But I think that they need to deliver really soon, because otherwise people will just be there virtually, or don't just attend special sessions, or let their ministers take place, because you need some kind of output legitimacy for the G20. And I hope that this will be possible in the coming years. But we have the informal group, and that has the limitations, that also has some plus things, but this is what we need to work on. Tech, data, and trade. When the European Union negotiates, it's no longer really about tariffs. It's about the regulatory barriers. It's about regulatory cooperation. It's behind the border things. So trade, increasingly, that's not only since tech, but this is all our major agreements that we have. It's less about tariffs and more about everything else. And so we need to find a way to get together. We didn't even manage that. Stacey mentioned EU and UK and EU. I mean, when you look at TTIP, we had the whole discussion that was about these issues as well. So what I think you're right in is that we don't agree of what we want to have. In Europe, we have a very strong data protection. We have the GDPR. We focus very much on data privacy. There are other countries who have the focus in a different area. So in my view, you can only have, that's what I mentioned, plurilateral agreements. You can no longer have multilateral agreements on this, because countries are not, they don't agree what they want to take out of it. And even with e-commerce, Owen mentioned that it's difficult enough. If you have the EU and US and China in the negotiations, it's very difficult to get an outcome on data privacy and data liberalization, because the focus is much different. So I think when you look at the G20, what they can do is basically just provide a platform, because the divisions run along G20 members. They're the major members that have the problems at the WTO as well. And you can just offer dialogue and platforms to talk about the critical issues, and hope that you will somehow overcome them in this more informal grouping. But it's the question of political will. If countries want to do that, I think it's going to be difficult.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to sort of turn to you, Klaus, with a maybe and I wouldn't even say paraphrasing, but pushing maybe what Claudia said a little further. If we look now at the G20 as the location to work out some of these broad divisions that have crept in between its major members, and then you go to the G20, you make your stances clear, you figure out who's on what side, and then you go back and you create your own plurilateral or regional or larger agreements, almost sort of solidifying into various blocks. What's the role then for civil society and for those various forums that surround the G20 in trying to bridge these divides? Because, and I'll tell you where I'm coming from, I don't see this as possible. All right, because the G20 is fundamentally all the work that we have done and all of us do around the G20 is based around the hope that in the end, the governments are interested in agreeing at that very table. And that's why we invest this energy in it. So why is it that we're not wasting our time if that energy, if the governments are not going to get agreement at that very table?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very important question. I think we need all hands on deck. That is very important for all of us, all the different stakeholder groups in the societies and worldwide, but also that's important for politicians to see they are needed on deck from the heads of state of the G20, but also in between of the specific countries, we have different levels of decision making on the political level. In Germany, the national, the regional, the state, and the local aspects are important. So to implement what is needed for the SDGs, for the 2030 agenda, only 9 years are left for us to bring it up, and to implement the climate agreement from Paris. I think it's so important to make in a collaborative way. And so the new situation we have now with Mr. Biden in the United States and the readiness of the others, more or less, to do it in a cooperative way and not only America first, Russia first, or China first. I think that's the first ground that is needed. And we need more ambition on all grounds. Ambition to protect biodiversity, more ambition on climate. We have now a summit just in front of us on the 12th of December, a smaller climate summit because the bigger one is postponed to next year in November. And most of the G7 countries enlarged their ambition since the last 3-4 months. And of course, United States are important now to follow in this track, but there are some good messages we get now from the new administration. They are ready. It's dependent now somehow on Georgia what will happen to really come forward to bring up more action on the national level. But I think the readiness is there, the awareness worldwide is there, and there's the pressure of the youth ask of the civil society. It was so important to have Fridays for Future and all the different other groupings around for future, scientists for future, entrepreneurs for future, and so on. And I think this movement is so important, but in the same sense, as I mentioned before, to have all hands on deck. We need the knowledge, we need the instruments from all these different groupings. And in Germany, it's interesting to see a wonderful group of business actors, companies, also now with very big ones like Heidelberger Cement. They really stand now for the 2-degree limit in the Paris Agreement and show up towards Chancellor Merkel. We will help you to implement on this, on the national level, on the European level. But I think, and I'm very clear about this, the Europeans have to do a big step forward, and then to invite others to do it together with us. So perhaps the G20 is only a grouping with groups in it, a group of more willing and other groups of not so much willing, but to make it transparent, to make it open to the public discussion, to show up. Some are willing and others are not willing. And so they get problems perhaps in between of their countries with their people. So this is more or less the direction. And I think civil society is absolutely needed in all parts of the world. We have the problem of shrinking space in many parts of the world. That's a big problem. Also, we have to address this also in the context of the G20. Otherwise, civil society can't work. So these are some points from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that we're almost at the end of our allotted hour. So I'll wind up by going back to you, Stacey. And, I think that your initial remark that you're not very hopeful, there is in some sense a degree of concern among all of us, partly because of the situation that we've been in for the past year, but also because of the growing divide between various members of the G20 that have been building before that. I'm going to sort of therefore ask you essentially two questions. The first is, you mentioned that the new administration in the US could signal its commitment to the G20 by calling an extraordinary meeting. Is there anything else that you could think of that would signal that the G20 also has and retains broad leadership in crisis management of the kind that it showed in 2008? I have a preferred candidate. I think that the G20, if could get together and commit that COVAX would be fully funded one way or the other. But you know, there might be other mechanisms, but is there something, or is it necessary for the G20 to make a demonstration of leadership in this crisis like it did earlier? And if so, what could it be? And I think the final point is, the reason it needs to make that demonstration of leadership is, to what degree do you feel that that the G20 now can genuinely be said to speak for developing countries in Asia and Africa, that maybe it represented a little better in 2008 when India was, you know, half its current per capita income, when China had just emerged from, was just moving into upper middle income status. China's now, from my perspective, 5 times India's per capita income. It's practically a developed country. You know, India, we don't believe we're a developed country yet, but you know, we've moved ahead as compared to some others. How is it that we can demonstrate that G20 continues to be inclusive enough to genuinely take the leadership role that it took in 2008?
Well, let me take those in reverse order. And first, I will say, be very careful about not meeting the needs of your constituents when you are trying to be a global forum, because they will find other ways to have their needs met. So, you know, we didn't give China enough of a voice at the World Bank, and so they started up the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. The United States made a big showing of how we're not going to join that bank because of the, you know, it doesn't meet the ESG requirements that we think, and various other reasons. And well, you know, 85 countries later have joined this thing to try to address a $4 trillion infrastructure deficit globally. So, you know, countries are going to find ways to meet together and to get what they need done. And the G20 needs to find ways to make itself inclusive of voices that are not just of the 2 richest countries. It's a very difficult balancing act. You know, AML-CFT is another one. You know, of course we want very proper financial systems, but, you know, we tried to kick Russia out of SWIFT because of the invasion of Ukraine, and Russia said, we will consider that an act of war. You cannot kick us out of the international messaging system of the global financial plumbing. We will recall ambassadors if you do that. And I kind of have some sympathy for that. And they trying to start up another thing with China, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I don't know to what extent that's going to work. I know this is not the point of this panel, but I do think that it needs to be in your top hits list, Claudia, is this idea of not just e-commerce, but of digital financial money and fintech as a separate actually vertical. And I think this needs to be given a lot of attention. I mean, we have a $1 trillion economy right now that doesn't use cash at all. And that economy is called Alibaba. That is a economy that is bigger than many countries in the globe. China is now rolling out a sovereign digital currency, and it considers that to be a very important weapon and element of its broader diplomacy. And I think the regulatory regimes and making sure that works well in coordination with the other kind of web governance and other things that are kind of associated with kind of some of these Belt and Road initiatives are very important for the G20 to get right, with the participation of China, of course. In terms of initiatives, your first question, I will say 2 things. One, I think the G20 needs to step up for debt relief and debt alleviation for developing countries. I think that could be the most important initiative that the G20 can do right out of the gate. This extending by 6 months a moratorium is, you know, they've given $5 billion, and $5 billion is nothing. It's nothing. And 6 of the 12 most hardest hit countries for the pandemic are not low income countries. They're not. They're sort of, you know, lower middle income countries that are not part of this debt relief initiative at all. I think this is imperative. And I'm talking about 150 million lives at stake if we can't do something about that, to give these countries the fiscal space that Rohinton talked about earlier. I do think another initiative, though, for that the Biden administration could spearhead is a summit of democracies. Bring democracies together in a global forum and have a coalition of democracies. And I think that could be a really important additional initiative for the Biden administration to take, in addition to its support of the G20 right out of the gate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, there's some sense in which we all believe that that's already on the agenda, or at least is being talked about. If I were to sum up what I think we've learned over the past hour, in some sense, it may not be too soon to say the G20 is facing a crisis of confidence. We have a crisis, a genuine pandemic on our hands, which has created an economic crisis, a debt crisis, a livelihood crisis, and there was, of course, already a climate change crisis. And the G20 does not appear to be, as of right now, effective at addressing any of these issues in particular. And so there's every hope that we have a year until, and we have to sort of, as Klaus said, you know, pull together a bit, put everything on the table, and see how we can create some consensus out of what has become a fairly divided group. Thank you all for participating, and on ORF's behalf, thank you for being here. And I look forward to more conversations of this sort.